Oh, I need to be a co-host here.
Oh, yes, sorry. I'm not as quick at this as Matt is, but I will get us there.
I'll go to
There we
work.
go. Co-host. Yes. There we go.
Ready? Okay. Come on. Can you all see this now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. So as you all know, in February, Russia with its ally Belarus attacked Ukraine. All of these countries identify as Christian. All of them are overwhelmingly Eastern Orthodox. The way Eastern Orthodoxy works is there are national churches. So there's a Russian Orthodox Church, a Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and a Belarusian Orthodox Church, but they're all Orthodox. And so what does Orthodoxy say about war? They don't have an explicit just war theory. They sort of accept the fact that war is inevitable and they tolerate it, but only for the protection of the innocent and the vindication of justice. That's the official position. So if you look at what's gone on in Russia in the last few decades, as Russia transitioned from the Soviet Union and the dominant country that formed out of the Soviet Union was Russia, that occurred in the 1990s. And that came at exactly the same, as Russia was being established as a country, came at exactly the same time that there was a resurgence of Russian Orthodoxy in Russia as a religion. And also at the same time that Vladimir Putin rose to political prominence. So all of those things are tied together. And we need to keep that in mind. Russian nationalism, Russian Orthodox Church, and Vladimir Putin are all tied together. And the support of any of them depends on the other two. So as a result of this, one of Putin's strongest bases in Russia is the Russian Orthodox Church. So he's trying to, that's why he was kind of saying some of the things he was saying about this invasion. He's repeatedly stated that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was for the protection of persecuted Russian people in eastern Ukraine and to provide justice to the Ukrainian people who are dominated by Nazis in the Ukrainian government. This is his justification for the war. Which matches the Orthodox ideas of what a war is supposed to be. But I wanted to point out that this is an example of how these religious justifications for war can be manufactured out of literally nothing. The Russian people in Ukraine were not being persecuted and have no need of protection, and there are no Nazis in the Ukrainian government. So this is Putin's attempt to try to shore up support of the Russian Orthodox Church and make sure that he maintains that support by trying to tie himself into this idea of how the Orthodox Church views war. But it's all fabrications. It's all made up. So we have the situation where you have two Christian countries engaging in a bloody war, and there's demonstrable examples of Russia committing war crimes against the Ukrainians. And right now, the Ukrainians have tracked over 8,000 war crimes the Russians have committed in Ukraine. So it's been extensive, we might say. And I thought we should take a look real quickly at what a war crime is. This is internationally mandated. These are war crimes via international agreements and treaties. It includes intentionally killing civilians during war, intentionally killing prisoners of war, torturing anybody, taking hostages, unnecessarily destroying civilian property. Deception by perfidy is the word that's used. What that means is you lie about something. Like if I was saying, oh, come, we'll talk about peace, we'll have a peace treaty, and when you get here, I kill all of you. That's perfidy. Whatever, that's lying about it. Then wartime sexual violence, pillaging, using child soldiers, committing genocide or ethnic cleansing, refusal to grant quarter despite surrender, and flouting the legal distinctions of proportionality and military necessity. What that last one means is you can claim, oh, it's necessary for us to to indiscriminately bomb the civilian population because our war needs require that, but that's not true. That's lying about military necessity. Or if one side ambushes a patrol and kills 6 people, and then the side that had their people killed responds by annihilating an entire city, that's not proportional. And that's would also be a war crime. So those are things I'd like to have you try to keep some of these in your mind, because war crimes are an important part of the Christian response to war. And we'll kind of revisit these a little bit later on. Oh, but as always, I would really encourage any discussion or thoughts or comments. Please throw them in at any time, and I would really, really treasure that. So please.
Rich, I had a
Yes.
question.
Yeah.
What does it mean, refusal to grant quarter?
Oh, that means like if somebody surrenders, and then as they're surrendering, you just kill them. You know, granting quarter means you house them, take care of them, allow them to live, and things like that. But you can't let them fight, of course, but you have to at least feed them and clothe them and give them shelter. That's what granting quarter means. And so if you refuse to do that, then there you go. That's a good example of yeah, well, the steel factory is kind of in the Ukraine, and Mariupol is one of the examples that I was thinking of the Anderson prisoner war camp in Georgia during the Civil War, which was a Confederate war camp for Union prisoners, and they refused to grant quarter. Basically, they didn't house them, they didn't feed them, they just left them to sit on the ground and so forth. And 13,000 Union soldiers died in 1 year. That's a war crime, and the only Confederate person who was convicted of a war crime after the Civil War was the commandant of that camp. So that's what we mean by refusing to grant quarter. Anything else? I know war crimes are tough to talk about because they're awful, 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 but it does come into play here. So one of the questions that we can ask is, of course, war is killing human beings. That's what war is all about. It's designed to kill people, and the more you kill of them, then the closer you are to victory. That's how it works. And killing human beings is forbidden in every culture on earth and by every major religion. So if everybody agrees that killing people is wrong, how can wars be waged? And this is a really good question. And it depends on this idea of the construction of the other. You judge somebody else negatively, you construct an other, is what they call this. You assign characteristics and motives to those people, which are designed to dehumanize them, to make them the other, the not us. So they're not us, they're other people, they're other things, they're wrong, they're evil, they do all these terrible things. And we, all wars depend on the construction of another like that. And it's only if you do that, if you dehumanize a group of people, can you justify then killing mass numbers of men, women, and children. And from a religious perspective, this is often an overt attempt to draw distinctions between our religion, which is true and right, and their religion, which is degraded and false. Okay. This is another way of constructing them as the other, by constructing them as the other religiously. And too often religious people have inflicted just the most horrifying death and destruction on people of different religions, and then claim that they're fulfilling God's purpose and plan in doing so. And we'll get back to that in just a moment. That's an actual term for that, and we'll come back to that in a second. So this construction of the other is fundamental, even though every culture, every religion forbids killing. So how did warfare begin? This is a huge topic. And in fact, there are probably a dozen things we're going to blast through today, which would be a really interesting Education Sunday in its own right. This is one of those. We're Homo sapiens. We evolved about 300,000 years ago. And for almost all of that time, we lived as hunter-gatherers. It wasn't until about 10 or 11,000 years ago that we invented agriculture. The archaeological evidence we have supports the idea that hunter-gatherers generally did not have warfare in the way we use the term today. There was violence and so forth, but warfare like we think of the term today was probably mostly absent during the hunter-gatherer days. So for most of our time on the earth, we have not had warfare. It was invented with agriculture. It was only then for the first time that there was territory to defend, and we had specialization of labor. In other words, professional soldiers and warriors developed. And it was only about that time that that happened. So there are rare examples of mass killings in hunter-gatherer times, but it doesn't look like what we would today call warfare. It was only after the invention of agriculture that we see weapons designed to specifically kill humans. We see forts and fortifications, and we see evidence of professional soldiers and armies. All of these are associated with the development of what we call civilization. So civilization also developed with agriculture, and they kind of went together with this. Got to have a quote by Dostoevsky. I keep going back to him. Matt smiles because he likes Dosto as well. But Dostoevsky said, civilization has made man, if not more bloodthirsty, at least more viciously, more horribly bloodthirsty. And that's what we're seeing in the development of this time period in human history. So these agricultural-based civilizations were developing in what is today Iraq and Turkey 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. By 4,000 to 5,000, 6,000 years ago, they were reaching the status of states and empires, things we'd recognize as countries or empires. And those are closely associated with warfare. That's how you build a state. It's especially how you build an empire. You can only do it through warfare. And so this Roman historian named Tacitus in 98 AD wrote this, which summarizes this: to ravage, to slaughter, to usurp under false titles. They call it empire. And where they make a desert, they call it peace. So peace is formed in empire when you destroy all the other people, basically is what he's saying. Now, what's interesting about this is all of the major religions in the world formed after this. All of them did. And they all formed in the presence of significant warfare. So they all have, and all major religions have the concepts of social justice at their core. And as a result, all of them have developed some kind of just war doctrine. In other words, religions have had to deal with war. How do we deal with this thing? You know, it's contrary to what we think is at the core of our religion. And how do we deal with it? And often we'll see 4 different responses. And some of those ways of dealing with it have been savage and some have been otherwise. So I thought we'd take a look before, we're going to focus on Christian responses to war here, but I thought we'd take a look at 2 non-Christian religions real quick, just to make the point that all religions have had to deal with this. So you know the term jihad in Islam. It's gotten real bad press because, whoops, sorry, I need to go back. Jihad has gotten real bad press because it has been distorted so badly, and most people in the West don't really have a clue what jihad really means. But in the Quran, which is the sacred book of Islam, jihad is their just war doctrine. It forbids offensive war and specifically outlaws essentially everything that's on the war crimes list. You just can't do those things. And so it doesn't say you can't fight, but it says you can only fight if you're attacked, and then you have to fight in a way which is appropriate for a Muslim. You know, you can't just do whatever you want. We often say that jihad means holy war, and that is not what the Quran says. There's nothing in the Quran about holy war. The Quran is clear that war can be fought justly, but it is never holy. So people today, some Muslims have distorted jihad for their own purposes. And it's for this reason that a large majority of Muslims reject Islamic terrorism that's based on jihad, as they recognize that it's a distortion of the teachings of the Quran. And the vast majority of Muslims reject it, of course, reject terrorism, but and it's for that reason. Buddhism is an interesting religion because nonviolence is at the very heart of Buddhism. There's nothing in Buddhist scriptures that give any support to the use of violence in any context at all. In times of war, Buddhists are commanded to show compassion and to help all living beings, period. And they have to abandon any fight that crosses their path. So if they get in a fight, they have to just leave, you know. So it's a overtly pacifistic sort of religion. And that's so ingrained that violence is unthinkable not only to humans, but to animals as well. And as a result, traditional Buddhists never kill animals and so never eat meat. I had the opportunity of being in a Buddhist temple in China, and they served us this meal, which you see here. A lot of things look like meat there, but it's all vegetables made to look like meat. And it was all vegetarian. And that's just how Buddhists do it. Now, keep that in mind that every one of these religions, Islam, Christianity, even Buddhism at times, have ignored their own teachings on this, you know, and have done whatever they felt like, you know, have done whatever or distorted them to suit their own purposes. And again, let's stress this, the Islamic terrorists, who are often called jihadists, is a corruption of the concept of jihad and is rejected by most Muslims. And when Buddhists have behaved badly, most Buddhists have rejected that. And Christians have behaved badly and so forth and so on. So we need to keep that in mind. So I thought we'd take a quick look at New Testament teachings about war and violence. This is Jesus speaking here. It might be useful to go through at least some of these. I leave peace with you. I give you my own peace. I do not give this to you as the world does. Those who work for peace are blessed. God will call them God's children. I tell you, love your enemies. Pray for those who usually use you badly. I give you a new commandment, love one another. As I have loved you, you must love one another. Jesus told them, put down your sword. Everyone who lives by the sword will die by the sword. And anyone who's angry, even angry with somebody else, must answer for it. And then from the epistles, we have a whole nother list of teachings about love and peace, God's peace, which is far beyond all human understanding, will keep your hearts and minds safe. God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. Try to be at peace with everyone. Try to live a holy life. No one will see God without these things. The only debt you should have is your obligation to love one another. Whoever loves all others has obeyed the whole law. The harvest given by the Spirit is love, joy, and peace. You desire what you do not have, so you kill. You want something, you know no other way to get it, so you fight and wage war. And this is a condemnation of that behavior in James. Let us love one another, since love comes from God. Anyone who fails to love cannot know God, because God is love. Anyone who says, I love God, and hates some other person is a liar. To love is to live according to God's commandments. So it's pretty clear that both Jesus and the epistles in the New Testament are laying out the Christian understanding of how we're supposed to live in terms of our relationships with other people. And I know it's kind of a cheap trick, but I thought I'd do this. These are all the scriptures in the New Testament in support of war. The point is there aren't any, okay? There are none. And so it seems pretty clear that Christianity has an overt sort of idea about how this is all supposed to work. But living up to teachings about war is difficult. At times, the United States has tortured prisoners, refused to honor treaties that we negotiated, attempted genocide, intentionally slaughtered civilians, firebombed civilian population concentrations, and summarily executed prisoners of war, all in a Christian country that expressly outlawed all of this. And it's easy to find images of warrior Jesus, if you want to, which resonates with certain kinds of Christianity. As you can see these images here, which are shocking to me. A book here, Jesus Was an Airborne Ranger, and it says, find your purpose following the warrior Christ. You know, I mean, it seems so at odds with what we read in the scriptures, but this resonates with a lot of Christians, this kind of hyper masculinity, you know, weapons bearing Jesus kind of thing, you know. So given this, and given what the Christian nation of Russia is doing to Ukraine, it's legitimate to ask, what is the Christian perspective concerning war? And that's all of these things together is what made me think this might be an interesting topic to pursue. So, and I really wanted to thank Judy for this because I asked her what she wanted to hear about. She said something about Putin, you know, I mean, and she helped me realize this is something probably other people might be interested in hearing about too. So, so we're going to take a look at 4 perspectives that have been associated with Christianity at times, and we're going to see how that plays out today in our lives and in the community of Christ. Okay. Any questions at this point? I mean, that's all kind of introduction. We're finally going to get to the stuff now. Okay. So when the community of Christ built our temple, which, you know, as you undoubtedly know, was finished in the 1990s, so approximately 30 years ago now, the church was committed at that point expressly to an emphasis on peace. The temple, as it says from Doctrine and Covenants, the temple shall be dedicated to the pursuit of peace. It shall be for reconciliation and for healing of the spirit, inspired by the life and witness of the Redeemer of the world. Of course, they're talking about Jesus there, and you can think back to some of those pronunciations that Jesus had about peace and about love and about compassion and so forth. And that's what we've been committed to as a church, at the very least since the 1990s, but there are roots of that go back farther than that as well. And so what the community of Christ has identified 4 perspectives on war and violence. There's other ways of organizing this, but these are useful, you know, and I thought what we would do is use these 4 ways that Christians have had perspectives on war and talk about each one so we can see what some of these perspectives are. If you really want to invest more in this, the church has this book, 4 Approaches to Violence, which you can get for free from Herald House. All you have to do is download it, and it's a digital download, and you get it for free. So it's easy to get. But the 4 perspectives are holy war, which is embracing war or taking it on; pacifism, which is rejecting war; just war, which is dealing with war; and then just peace, which is preventing war. And so we're going to take a look at these 4 topics. We'll spend most of our time talking about the last 2 probably, but let's get at this. Holy war, I don't want to spend much time with. This occurs when Christians embrace war. It is contrary to the teachings of Jesus. War is never holy, period. It is never holy. But it's the term that's been given to those who have launched wars, who felt that God has commanded them to fight, and whose motives and purposes are thought to be God ordained and in keeping with God's plan. So God wants us to go kill these people. God wants us to do these things. This is a holy thing that we're doing, and so we're going to go do this. I want to stress that any kind of reading of the scriptures of the New Testament makes it clear that this is, I don't know how strongly to put this, but could be said to be blasphemy, because this is not what Jesus was talking about. There's no evidence for this at all in the New Testament, but it has certainly been common in the Christian experience. So we can look at these examples. The massacres of the Canaanites by the Hebrews after the Exodus, as Joshua led the Israelites into Israel after they came out of Egypt, are examples of holy wars. The Crusades are the prototypical kind of example of holy wars. There are a bunch of Crusades, 9, I think, all in total, over about 300 years in the early part of the last millennium. And they were without a doubt holy wars, and they were without a doubt horrible things. The 30 Years' War, which happened in Europe in 1618 to 1648, lasted 30 years. How about that? Was religiously motivated. It came about after the Protestant Reformation, and was an effort by Protestants and Catholics to try to, overwhelm the other side, and so it can be seen as a holy war. The experience in the United States of the extermination and land appropriation of Native Americans by Euro-Americans, there was very definitely a religious component to that, and it very definitely took the form of a holy war. The Nazi Holocaust against the Jews in World War II was a holy war based on religion and so forth. So this has been unfortunately common, and it's a real thing. Genocide is a common outcome here. And if you need a definition of genocide, it's the deliberate killing of a large group of people, especially those of a particular nation, ethnic group, or religion. In this context, in holy war context, it's usually those killed would be targeted at least partially because they're non-Christian or the wrong kind of Christian. And that's how a lot of holy wars have been waged.
Incorrectly described as holy war.
It is, Teresa makes a good point, it's incorrectly described as holy war. That the terms are counter each other. You can't have holy and you can't have war in the same sentence. But this is what people call it. So it's a distortion of that. There's still people who have this notion today. I mean, it's not gone, certainly. This is still common, in Christianity and in other religions as well. Let's look at pacifism now, which is sort of the exact opposite of that. This is one form of Christian response to an active war. We can define Christian pacifism as the theological and ethical position that any form of violence is incompatible with the Christian faith, because Jesus was a pacifist who taught and practiced pacifism and told his followers to do likewise. And of course, as Christians, you all know, we have been instructed that we are to follow the example of Jesus. And so pacifists say Jesus was a pacifist, so we should be pacifists. We should not ever support any kind of violence. This was so strong, and you saw those scriptures that Jesus said, and the epistles of the early church. So for the first 300 years of the Christian church, it was essentially entirely pacifistic. It means that the members, Christian members, were not allowed to serve in the military or fight in wars if they desired to remain in fellowship as a Christian. They simply couldn't be a soldier and be a Christian during the first 300 or so years of the Christian experience. And I think it's interesting to note that Roman soldiers who converted to Christianity faced a really awful choice. They could give up their Christian faith, or they could leave the Roman army, but they couldn't leave the Roman army without deserting. And if you deserted, you would be executed. So they either had to give up their Christian faith or face execution. It's a pretty awful choice. And there's a number of examples of martyrs to the Christian faith among former Roman soldiers who said, okay, you have to kill me because I'm not giving up my Christianity and I'm not going to fight. So it was kind of a tough business. We're going to talk in a moment about how Christianity changed from a pacifistic religion to a just war religion. We'll get to that in a minute. But even after they did that, Christians and other religious leaders for centuries have been pacifistic. So this is still a current thread in Christianity today. An early one, St. Martin of Tours, said, I'm a soldier of Christ. I am not allowed to fight. He's just not going to do it. Thomas Merton, you may or may not be familiar with him, is an extremely influential Roman Catholic priest who died in 1968. So relatively recent, very influential. And he said, I am against war, against violence, against violent revolution, and for peaceful settlement of differences, for nonviolent but nevertheless radical change. That's what he stood for. Martin Luther King Jr., from a religious perspective, remember he was a minister, said he was against violence in all forms. He told his followers to submit to the violence done to them and do not respond, do not hit back ever. You know, that's an extremely pacifistic sort of approach. And here's one of his quotes: "Mankind must put an end to war, or war will put an end to mankind." And King was strongly against the Vietnam War, strongly against all wars. Mohandas Gandhi was not a Christian, but he was influenced by Christianity, influenced by the teachings of Jesus, among other things. And he said that he died in 1948. Gandhi said, "Was not war itself a crime against God and humanity? And therefore, were not all those who sanctioned, engineered, and conducted wars war criminals?" So Gandhi was saying that any war made the people who were part of it war criminals. That's how strongly he was pacifistic. He, by the way, was had to serve in the military in World War I in the British Army, because India was a British colony, and was struggling with his response to this, and chose then to serve as an ambulance driver, which he felt allowed him to provide healing and compassion in the midst of all the war. So he never picked up a gun. That's how he handled that. So every war in US history, Christian pacifists have refused to fight and to serve, often paying for their devotion with lengthy jail sentences, because it's always been against the law to do that. Christian pacifism is almost always the basis of somebody seeking conscientious objector status for religious reasons. As you know, some churches are entirely pacifistic. The Mennonites and the Society of Friends, which we call Quakers, are completely pacifistic. They will not allow their people to be involved with the military. And the Quakers are the only religious organization to win the Nobel Peace Prize. That's how strongly they have embraced this kind of an idea. I think it's an interesting note that Richard Nixon, who was president of the United States during the second half of the Vietnam War, was a Quaker. He was raised as a Quaker and was excommunicated because of his Vietnam policies. So they were pretty serious about that, in terms of not supporting warfare. So there's the two traditions that are entirely pacifistic. I should point out that even though we're dedicated to the pursuit of peace, the Community of Christ is not a pacifistic church. Okay, although as we'll see now, it has been present in the Community of Christ and is at least supported in the Community of Christ. I want to mention F. Henry Edwards. You may know he was a longtime member of the First Presidency. Before that, he was a longtime member of the Council of 12. So he was a big deal for a long time in the church, from the 1920s to 1950s. He was almost certainly the most important single person in the church. Some people say he was actually running the church during Israel Smith's presidency. We'll see, but he was a big deal. He was no small potatoes. But he refused to fight in World War I. He absolutely refused to fight. He was British. He said, "I'm not going to fight," because he was a pacifist. As it's described as his patriotism was not for the British Empire, but for the kingdom of God. And in response, he was court-martialed, suffered 112 days of hard labor, and then 2 years of work, which is part of his prison term. And the source I saw on this said that this was not an easy thing. 70 people died doing this, and 30 went insane from the abuse that was suffered. He tolerated all that rather than give in to his belief, reject his beliefs. Now, our church, which is the RLDS at the time, and a lot of other churches, were really hostile to conscientious objectors. The president of the church during World War I was Fred M. Smith, and he had no time. His quote was, "For pacifists and cowardly slackers." He wanted nothing to do with them. He didn't want them in the church. He was angry. He was angry at F. Henry Edwards. But they kind of reconciled. F. M. Smith called Edwards into the Council of 12, and Edwards married Smith's daughter. So they got related by marriage. So they kind of patched things up, but it was dicey for a while there. But the church, our church, Community of Christ, was overtly hostile to members seeking conscientious objector status until the 1960s. They simply wouldn't support it. They said, "I'm sorry, you're out of luck." And when they did finally start supporting conscientious objectors, it was grudging at first, but has expanded and has become more common. And today, I think it's safe to say the church generally supports a member who refuses military service and seeks conscientious objector status for religious reasons. The church, I think, will support that. And the church has the theology and the scriptures to support that as well. This is a really important step for people who want to be COs, because it is very, very difficult to obtain CO status for religious reasons if your church does not support you. So it's made it possible for some Community of Christ people to become conscientious objectors over the last 4 or 5 decades. Now let's look at just war. This is sort of the de facto Christian response for most people. It's an attempt to make a necessary war less brutal. And to understand how just war came about, we have to go all the way back to the 300s to Constantine, who was a Roman emperor. And he converted to Christianity in 313 AD. He's the first Roman emperor to do that. That act, and then he decreed that Christianity to become the official religion of the empire, because he was a Christian. He wanted everybody to be a Christian, you know. And that produced just unbelievably massive changes in Christianity, because Christianity very quickly went from a small, kind of often persecuted movement to the official instrument of the Roman Empire, which means it was an imperial religion tied to the power of the Roman Empire. And that power was based on military power. The Roman military was easily the best in the world at the time, and they were stomping over everybody, you know, and that's where their power came from and where the empire, how the empire existed. It seemed obvious to Roman authorities that a pacifistic religion was incompatible with their empire. You know, they couldn't just dissolve the military, you know. So the theologian who was most important in developing the theology that allowed Christianity to become an imperial religion after Constantine's conversion was Augustine, who lived, and you see the dates for his life. And he was the one, he developed all kinds of new theology for Christianity. But one of the things he did was he developed the first Christian just war doctrine, which allowed the Roman Empire to continue to be a military power. And that was the basis of him doing this.
Rich?
Yeah.
So this is a bit off topic, but it is a question I have. Is there much documentation about how Constantine became a Christian? Because like it's
you know, I'm gonna pretend like my audio just went out then. I didn't hear that question because I don't know the answer. I think there is documentation on it. And I think I vaguely remember reading about it once, and I don't have it in my head. So,
well, and that's fine. It just seems that for it is a very, very pivotal point in Christianity. And I'd be very, you know, how does a Roman emperor ever get convinced that Christianity is the, you know what I'm saying? It's like,
it
what's
sounds
in
like
it
a
for
good
him?
education. Sounds like good education study to me.
I think
But
it would be a good one.
it
how does
would
that
be,
even-
and some of the changes that came about as a result of that would be part of all that, I think.
Mhm.
I'm trying to bring this up from the depths of my faulty memory, but I think it had something to do with some family members of his that became Christian, but I don't want to swear to that, and I don't want to say anything more.
I think your honest answer of not actually having an answer is fine for now, but I think
Okay.
that might be a good topic for an education Sunday moving forward.
It would be kind of fun to talk about because Christian, it was very pivotal, extremely pivotal event in history. Some people have said it's what caused the downfall of the Roman Empire. Once we became Christian, they couldn't maintain the empire. That's a whole nother story.
Okay,
But
I'll
yeah,
let you
great
continue on
question.
about just war.
Just war, okay? So here's Augustine's doctrine of just war. This is how he said you knew that a war was just. Number one, Christians should never immediately resort to violence. So that's coming out of that pacifistic tradition. Number two, however, it is sinful to do nothing in the presence of a serious wrong that can only be stopped by violence. So he defined that as a sin. So you have to always stop with violence something that can only be stopped by violence. Okay. And Christians can be involved in warfare when a legitimate state authorizes it. So one of his quotes here is, by divine edict, Christians have no choice but to subject themselves to their political masters and seek to ensure that they execute their fighting duty as justly as possible. If you're thinking that's really ambiguous, you're right. That's very ambiguous, and people kind of ignored it and just did whatever they wanted for the most part. And so 800 years later, probably tied with Augustine as the most important theologian in the church over the last 2,000 years, was Thomas Aquinas, who is extraordinarily influential. And he revisited the just war idea, needed to be revisited. And it came about, what triggered it was the excesses of the sack of Constantinople in 1204. That was the Crusaders, Christian Crusaders, on a holy war, just completely obliterated the city of Constantinople, killing everybody, raping, pillaging, destroying. It was just absolutely awful. Nobody had ever seen anything quite like it before. And that was all pretty fresh in people's minds, and Thomas Aquinas's minds. I should point out that Augustine and Aquinas were both Catholic, and the Roman Catholicism has dominated the conception of just war in Christianity. So we're going to keep referring to the Roman Catholic just war theory, but it's the one that's dominated all Christianity. So here's Aquinas's rules for a just war, okay? It must be waged by a properly instituted authority, a state, okay? Must occur, number two, must occur for a good and just purpose, not self-gain or exercise of power. And here's a really important point that people often forget. Interest of the state is not a just cause. So just because the state says we're going to go to war, that doesn't make it just. Okay, and Aquinas was very clear about this. He said just purposes would be something like restoring some good that's been denied, like lost territory, lost goods, or punishment for an evil perpetrated. That's what a just cause is. Just because the president, the king, or the emperor says to go is not a just cause. And number three is peace must be the central motive, even in the midst of violence. So this is a little bit more straightforward. This is a little bit more detailed. And what's interesting about this is points 1 and 2 are guidelines to tell you when you can go to war. And 3 is a guideline to tell you how to wage that war, how to actually conduct it. And this is what these two parts, when to go to war and how to fight the war, have dominated almost all religious discussions of warfare. So keep those in mind, because we're going to add to that a little bit later on, okay?
Okay, another question, Rich.
Yeah.
And I think it's because of previous Education Sundays, I now know that the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church split off around 1000 AD.
1054.
1054, which means that the Russian Orthodox Church / the Ukrainian Orthodox Church wouldn't have had Aquinas's just war doctrine as a part of their main stuff.
Exactly. They would have, I mean, it was out there. They could have read the book, but that didn't mean they had no authority in the Orthodox Church. Exactly right. That's one reason why they don't have a overt just war theory.
Okay. They would kind of be,
Go ahead.
would they be more dependent on Augustine then than Aquinas as far as just war goes?
Definitely.
Okay.
It's a really good point, actually. So in that, the current version of the Roman Catholic just war doctrine was promulgated in 1992. This is what's current now. This is what just war is now for most Christians. And there are 4 conditions now that will allow Christians to go to war, to be just. Number 1, damage inflicted by the aggressor has to be lasting, grave, and certain. Okay. Number 2, all of the means of putting an end to aggression must be impractical or ineffective. Number 3, there must be serious prospects for success. And number 4, use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver or more serious than the evil to be eliminated. So this is pretty to the point here. And this is what a just war would look like from the point of view of Christianity in general, or is the closest thing we have. So I thought we'd ask real quick, often World War II has been seen as being a just war. Actually, we've said every war we've ever fought has been just, but some of that's obviously not true. But World War II seems to be a good candidate for that. I thought we'd run through these four to see if World War II stacks up, okay? And you can jump in here if you want. Damage inflicted by the aggressor, well, Hitler and the military government of Japan, yes, I think there's no doubt
Yes.
that number
Absolutely.
one is very true. Number two, neither Hitler nor the military government of Japan were interested in negotiating away these things. They simply didn't do that. So two is also met. There was no
Yeah.
other practical way of responding. Number three must be serious prospects for success. That's I mean, at the beginning of the war, we're not so sure about that, but we created the conditions where that was in effect. So yes, that one seems to be upheld as well. And number four, use of arms must not produce evils and disorders greater than the evil to be eliminated. This is where we get dinged a lot in World War II. But in general, people say mostly, yeah, you know, and so we can say World War II was probably just according to this criteria.
I think
Until
Until
the end where
Until the
it was
yeah.
where we used nuclear weapons,
which
atomic
is
weapons.
not just, and we have, and we can talk about that because there's the argument that that helped save lives because we didn't have to invade Japan and all this kind of stuff. It's much more complicated than that. We don't have time to get into that right now. Another education Sunday.
The civilian victims in the firebombs in
we're
Germany.
getting that.
Okay, and then civilian victims of nuclear.
Yeah, the civilian victims in general, we're going to get to that now, because what I want to do is look at the interpretation of the just war doctrine. Because every war that's ever been fought has been justified by those who wanted to have the war as being just. Everybody did. Putin has done that for the invasion of Ukraine. Everybody has done that. Hitler thought he was just in launching World War II. You know, everybody has thought that. But it's very debatable that the four categories above are met in all cases. And in fact, in most cases, they probably haven't been met. So most wars have not been just. I think we might be able to make the case that World War II was as close as any war in our history to being just. But what's interesting, if we take World War II as that, even during the war, there would be isolated examples of things which were not just. So let's assume for now World War II was a just war, but there were things that were not. Teresa raises a good point that I want to get to now in World War II. First, these are examples, but it gives us an idea. Cassino, Italy in 1944, massive aerial bombardment by the United States. And this is a weapons strategy which is very hard to convey as being just. And in the case of Cassino, American forces bombed a German troop concentration there, but they also obliterated the entire town, all of its people, and the Catholic Abbey. Everything went. Now, a lot of people would argue that violates point 4 of the just war criteria. Use of arms must not produce evils and disorders greater than the evil to be eliminated. And it had massive civilian casualties. So one of the things that's interesting, and another thing we could talk about in Education Sunday is the concept of total war. But all wars now are fought as total wars. And a total war is a function of industrialized warfare and all kinds of things like that. We won't get into that right now. But total war often assumes that civilians are legitimate targets. Just war does not allow civilians to be harmed. So it's a real point here. Might be difficult to find a real just war in the modern total war era. So here's what Cassino looked like after the bombing. And this is the Abbey up here. The town was all on this hill here. You can see it's completely gone. completely obliteration. It's hard to see this as just. Now, you may say it was just one raid and so forth, and maybe they overstepped their bounds that time, who knows. But aerial bombardment was commonly used throughout Germany and Japan by American forces. Here's the city of Durham, for example, was targeted for aerial bombardment in November 1944. The plans for the raid, which were written down, and we have those plans, called for indiscriminate bombing designed to, and the words they used, completely obliterate the city. That was the goal, was to obliterate the city. And thousands of civilians were killed. Now, it's really hard to say that this is just war. And then you take it one step farther. I didn't want to get into this because it's too big of a topic, but then we developed firebombing as a war weapon. And we firebombed mostly in Japan. And in just 2 raids in Tokyo, 500,000 civilians were killed, burned to death. You know, it's really hard to see that as just war. So firebombing is a whole different thing. It's a whole different level. We don't have time to get into that right now. And we used it extensively. And then we had the nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs that we dropped. All of those are hard to justify as just war. But maybe you could argue the entire war as a whole was just, with these exceptions or something like that. That's why it gets complicated coming up with just war. And I thought we'd look at this complexity of this. Again, World War II in March 1945, the British Air Force bombed the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen, Denmark. That action saved a lot of lives in the Danish resistance. And probably can be seen as being a legitimate thing. But due to a tragic mistake, they also bombed a school and killed 145 civilians, mostly children and nuns. And it's, you know, killing children is a war crime, period. There's no other way of saying that, you know. But how do you interpret that if it's a mistake? It wasn't intentional. Are those still war criminals that did that? It's complicated. And people fuss about this all the time. Here's a photo of that raid. This is the school back here burning right here. The guy running for his life here. This is taken during the raid, apparently. I didn't take the photo. So people have argued there should be a third requirement for just war. Remember the 2 general conditions for just war, whether or not it's just to go to war and ways in which the war is conducted. People have argued there should be a third condition. The post-war period should be just as well. And so modern just war theory now is starting to talk about this third condition, that after the war, there should be justice as well. And that's fueled primarily by the Iraq War that the United States fought. It produced huge areas of infrastructure destruction and political instability. We militarily said we accomplished our goals a few months after the war began, but it launched an insurgency, which is still going on in some respects. It's clear that we had a plan to fight the war, but it's clear we had no plan on what to do after the war. And as a result, massive number of civilians have been killed, wounded, or dislocated as a result of this in the post-war, after we said the war was over. Estimates for civilian deaths range from 150,000 to over 1 million. And so people say, you know, we really just war should have taken care of those people afterwards and should have taken care of the things like that happened after the war. So people are now talking about a third requirement for just war. Now, are there any questions about just war? I mean, this has dominated the Christian discussion on warfare, you know, for the most part. And so it's, if we want to launch into it, we can. Just keep in mind, it's often misused or distorted.
I would just say, Rich, that with this third requirement for just war, World War II kind of got closer to actually the when.
I'm going to stop you right there, Matt. I'm going to stop you right there because look at this. Third requirement in World War II. There was huge infrastructure damage to Germany, Italy, and Japan during World War II, a huge refugee problem. I don't think people appreciate it. There were millions and millions of refugees in Europe after World War II, wandering the continent. with no homes and so forth. It was awful. And the Allies, led by the United States, poured a huge amount of money and effort into rebuilding Europe and Japan after World War II. It's called the Marshall Plan. Now, we don't underestimate the hard work and sacrifice on the part of the German and Japanese people, because they worked really hard. I actually, as a child, was in both Germany and Japan during the 50s and 60s and saw the rebuilding that was going on. And they worked really hard and they made a lot of sacrifices, but still, with the American support, it produced a rapid and remarkable economic resurgence in both those areas, and Germany and Japan became major economic players starting in the 1960s. So critics can rightly point out that a lot of that was done to try to keep them from becoming communist, but who cares? Still, human needs were addressed, society was addressed, the recovery was relatively rapid, and this seems to bolster the claim that World War II was a just war. You know, the post-war treatment seems to bolster that. Just a few pictures, German, what?
I also want to point out that if we think about our current relationships with Germany and Japan, they are a lot closer than they would have been otherwise. And
Absolutely.
yeah, and it just like what used to be like, they used to be our absolute enemies, and they are now some of our closest allies.
And you can see the difference between that and China and Russia.
Right.
Because we did not help Russia, we did not help China after World War II, and both those were massively destroyed. Russia more than any other country on earth. We didn't do a thing for them, and they're our two major enemies now. So it would have been good geopolitics to help, but that's another story. So here's a few photographs of German refugees. Look at the cities. Every city in Germany looked like this after World War II. Everything. It was just unbelievably bad for people. I won't go into that. Here's the Brandenburg Gate, the symbol of Berlin, just shells. This is 1945, after the end of the war, shells of buildings around here. Here's what it looks like now. It's been rebuilt. It's functioning again. Here's the Reichstag, which is the German parliament in 1945. This is what it looked like at the end of the war. Now it looks like this. They rebuilt it. I mean, this is a huge effort. It took until 1999 before this building was finished, but they rebuilt it. So. Now, we're running short on time. I apologize for that, but let me just talk about just peace for a little bit real quick, and we'll finish this up. Just peace deals with preventing wars from happening by creating worlds of social justice. The focus is on justice, not war. And it must be stressed, these four categories are not mutually exclusive. We tend to like put things in categories that this is not appropriate here. The third requirement of just war we just talked about can easily be seen as just peace as well. And pacifism and just peace have a lot of places where they overlap and intersect. So these are not mutually exclusive. But just peace addresses issues of poverty, sexism, racism, climate change, and other forms of social injustice, nationalism, and the quest for national and ethnic power. These are the causes of war. And if you address these root causes, you can do something with that. So it's often seen as existing in four contexts. This is going to sound familiar to you. I think community, peace in homes, peace amongst all ethnicities, genders, and social classes, elimination of fear and oppression, and those are exploited. In the earth, ending violence against the earth by living in a way that the earth can be healed environmentally. Taking real and necessary steps towards addressing the issues of climate change, because I can promise you in the 21st century, climate change is going to trigger more wars than you can shake a stick at. It is going to be awful. And we've got to address climate change, if for no other reason than to minimize the threat of warfare. Economics, eliminating the massive gap between rich and poor and creating economic systems that are fair, balanced, and allow everyone to live with dignity. And world cultures, putting human security ahead of national security, eliminating the scourge of nationalism and the lust for national power and exceptionalism. Reconciliation among all people is the goal. These are things which you've heard a lot about in our church. And the reason why is because it's an expression of the kingdom of God, which includes the community of Christ concept of Zion. So Zion, as you know, I don't have to tell you this, is a community with reconciliation, right living, economic justice, and obtained not through violence, but through preaching, persuasion, being involved in social processes, and living Zionic lives. And the community of Christ, if they come down on any one of these four, says, we like just peace. This is the one we like best, because of course our tradition of Zion makes it a logical fit. And that's our primary paradigm for addressing violence and war. And we stand for nonviolence, but the church also says overtly, it accepts the necessity of using legitimate military force when necessary to protect the innocent and vulnerable. So the church is a just peace church with a fallback of just war. So it's not a pacifistic church. That's how our church is right now. This is my last slide, and we're done. I thought some thought questions. You can take these with you. Given these different perspectives and what you know about the war in Ukraine, is it proper that the United States has sent billions of dollars in weapons to the Ukraine? Should the United States do more, such as directly intervene militarily in that war? And if so, how and to what degree? You know, what's a just response there? To what degree do we as a country and as us as Christians accept that the end justifies the means? So if we can get rid of the Russians out of Ukraine, should we just go do terrible things or not? You know, that's a really hard question. And then should Christians root for one side to do well in a war, even if that means they're killing their opponents? You know, like, and I put this, is Teresa and I have this up in our front yard. This is our little shrine to the Ukrainians. And by the way, Linda, thank you for the sunflowers that you gave us in church, because that's these two things right here. That's a symbol of the Ukrainian flag. So we're clearly on the side of Ukrainians here, but that means they're killing Russians. Is that what Jesus would do? Well, it's a hard question. But I think we can clearly see, if we go back to the four criteria for just war, that from the Ukrainian point of view, it's a just war. I think they're not missing on any of those 4 points. From the Russian point of view, it's not a just war.
No, that's
And
definitely
so
not.
it makes it a little easier for me to say, go Ukraine. But at the same time, they're killing Russians, you know, and that's not an easy thing to accept. So I'm done now. Not too late. What, 8 minutes, 9 minutes? It's good for me. Yeah, it's really good for me.
So Rich,
Yeah.
we've been attending discussions on nonviolence with the church. Like we've had weekly Thursday night discussions on these things. Our final one was this last Thursday. And so part of the wrap up of those discussions, they had 3 different people speak on out of their own personal experience. And one of them was Kuzma Brutsky, and he's married to Carla Long, and he's Ukrainian, and now living in the United States. And so he spoke about this, you know, from his perspective as a Ukrainian and as a member of the church. And it was, you know, kind of really squarely talking about the just peace, right? And, you know, and it was interesting to, you know, hear him say, like, as much as it pained him, and it was really painful to know that his, you know, the Ukrainians had to go fight the Russians, right? But they were protecting the vulnerable, right? So they were protecting his people. And so, so it was really, you know, interesting to say, you know, that with the just peace perspective, it's like war is not a glory thing for sure, right? Like it is I mean, it was just painful for him to know that it had to come down to that. So
It is tough.
yeah. Thank you
Anybody
very
else?
much for sharing.
Sure. Anybody else have anything you want to throw in here or what?
It was very good, Rich.
Oh, thanks.
Answer your question.
It didn't answer the original question you asked me, Judy, about Putin and God and all that kind of stuff, but at least it triggered this kind of thought. So
When I get really angry, I wish somebody would, all we'd have to do is get rid of Putin.
and is that what Jesus would do? Would Jesus go shoot Putin in the head?
That's I have to, I have to hold off. But
You have to hold off, yeah. We're all works in progress, aren't we?
I mean, it just seems like if he would, because he's lying to his own people. This is all about him. And that's what bothers me.
You know, what's bothers me about Putin is we've known he's been this way for 20 years. He's been this way for 20 years. We've known that all along. We've had, he's not going to change. We've had a lot of politicians in the United States favoring him and liking him and so forth. And I just wonder what were they thinking? We've always known this about Putin. This is not just like a new Putin that suddenly showed up.
Oh,
He's
no.
always been this way. And it's just astonishing to me that we have people who, well, I'm betraying my feelings now, which is not why you signed on, but it's just stunning to me that this has happened. So.
All right.
So, well, anyway, I'm done. Thank you all for your patience and for allowing me to bend your ear here.
All right, thank you.